This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nicol, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at cards with a Grixis identity. Grixis refers to one of the three-color factions that made its debut in 2009's Shards of Alara, where Grixis was the name of the plane that focused on blue, black, and red. While there have been other factions over the years that occupy these same three colors, Grixis is the name for this color combination that has stuck around. This is actually the second time I've looked at Grixis cards. The first time was back in 2020, but we've gotten a lot more cards with this three-color identity over the last 3 years, and the list has changed significantly. A card has a Grixis identity if blue, black, and red mana symbols appear somewhere on the card without any other colored mana symbols appearing. In all, there were 100 cards that qualified for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's start with a look at the 5 cards that were on the list last time, but didn't make it this time, starting with Nicol Bolas Planeswalker, which was at number 10 last time. The original Nicol Bolas was one of the first Grixis cards ever, having been printed in Legends, the first set to feature multicolored cards, and ever since then, every single card that represents him is in those 3 colors. So, while this version of Bolas didn't make the list, you can bet we're going to be seeing a lot more of him on it. Nicol Bolas Planeswalker was the first time he appeared as a Planeswalker, and he packs some serious power. For 4 generic, a blue, 2 black, and a red, he starts with 5 loyalty. He has a +3 that can destroy a non-creature permanent, a -2 that permanently gains control of a creature, and a -9 that does 7 damage to a player, makes them discard 7 cards, and sacrifice 7 permanents. Obviously enough, that combination of abilities is impressive, but between the mana value and how color intensive he is to cast, he's never really caught on in a big way anywhere. He saw a bit of play in 5-color control decks in Standard, and in the time since the 2020 list, he has started seeing some play in Legacy decks that look to cheat him into play with Arena Rector. Nicol Bolas Planeswalker could find himself on the list again in the future, alongside his fellow Bolas cards, as he only fell a few points short of it this time. Next, there's Sidraxis Spectre, which was at number 9 last time. For 1 of each Grixis color, you get a 3/2 with flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. It also has Unearth for 1 generic and a black, which means you can pay that cost to bring it back from the graveyard and give it haste until end of turn, and then it gets exiled at the beginning of the next end step. The Spectre gives you a reasonably efficient flyer who can go after the opponent's hand, and the addition of Unearth means you can end up taking away more than 1 card. It gained a single point in Standard back in 2010, so it won't ever be finding its way back on the list again. Next, there's Kess Dissonant Mage, which was at number 8 last time. For 1 generic and 1 of each Grixis color, Kess is a 3/4 flyer, and during each of your turns, she lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. If you do, you exile that spell. That's a very powerful effect. Kess has a couple of points from Legacy Grixis decks, but both of them came back in 2018, and she's been idle ever since, so she's probably not going to make her way back onto the list. Next, there's Crosis' Charm, which was at number 7 last time. Nicol Bolas is not the only Grixis dragon out there. There's also Crosis, who debuted in Invasion Block. That set had a cycle of 3 colored dragons, and each of them had a charm. The charm is an instant that costs 1 mana of each Grixis color, and like all charms, it's a modal spell that gives you 3 different choices. Most modal cards aren't especially efficient at what they can do, but the flexibility that they grant you makes up for that. This charm can destroy a non-black creature, bounce a permanent, or destroy an artifact. That flexibility means that it can always do something, and generally, it will at least have some impact on the board. It also means that you can have Artifact Hate in your main deck without paying too high a price for it. Crosis' Charm was featured in Grixis control decks in the Standard of 2001, managing a top 8 at Worlds that year, but because it's been so long since it's gained points, it's another card that won't ever make its way back into the top 10. And the last card that made the 2020 list that didn't make it this time is Crosis himself, who was at number 5 last time. For 3 generic and 1 of each Grixis color, he's a 6/6 flyer, and when he hits the opponent, you can pay 2 generic and a black. If you do, you choose a color, and your opponent discards all cards of that color. If you choose correctly, Croesus can make it quite difficult for your opponent to put up a fight. Croesus gained all of his points in Extended, where he was played as a singleton copy in Reanimator decks. He was especially nice to get against opponents who planned on holding onto their hands, because if you could get Croesus into play on turn 2, and then make them discard most of their hand on turn 3, something that deck was very capable of, it was pretty much game over from there. Like his charm, though, Croesus hasn't gained any points for a very long time, and is unlikely to find himself back on the list. Alright, now that we've looked at the cards that fell off of the list, let's move to the list proper, starting with our number 10 card, which is Rise and Fall, which was at number 4 last time. While it has the same score as Croesus the Purger, it got to hang on to a spot on the list because its points came from decks with a higher average finish. Rise and Fall is a split card, which means you can choose to cast one side or the other. The Rise side costs a blue and a black, and it's a sorcery that returns a creature card from your graveyard and a creature on the battlefield to their owner's hands. Fall is a sorcery that costs a black and a red, and it forces a player to reveal 2 cards from their hand at random, and for each non-land card revealed that way, they discard it. Both of these have the potential to deliver some pretty amazing value for the cost in the right situation, and the fact that you have access to one or the other means you're going to be able to do something with this seemingly situational card more often than you would otherwise be able to. Rise and Fall managed the top 8 in Ravnica block, constructed an Rakdos aggro deck, and also as a single top 8 from a modern Grixis control deck from back in 2015. While it did manage to hang on to a spot on the list this time, it only barely managed to do so, I think if I revisit this list again in 3 years, you're not going to find it here. At number 9, it's Sauron the Dark Lord, a newcomer to the list that didn't even exist back in 2020. In fact, it was only printed earlier this year in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. For 3 generic and 1 mana of each of the Grixis colors, he's a 7/6 with a very tricky ward to get around. If you target Sauron with something, it gets countered, unless you sacrifice a legendary artifact or legendary creature. So, already we're talking about a very resilient creature, but this is the eponymous Lord of the Rings, so you know it has a lot more going on. Anytime your opponents cast a spell, you amass Orcs 1, which means you either get a 1/1 Orc army token or put a +1/+1 counter on an Orc army token. Then when an army deals combat damage to a player, the ring tempts you, and when the ring tempts you, you can discard your hand and draw 4 cards. In short, Sauron is hard to kill, delivers a ton of value even if your opponent does kill him, and if left unchecked is pretty close to unbeatable. When it comes to 60-card formats, Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth cards are only legal in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but despite that limitation, Sauron has quickly found a home for himself in Legacy Reanimator decks. While he isn't quite as game-breaking as Griselbrand or Atraxa, his ward makes him almost impossible to kill for most Legacy decks, especially in the early game. He's even effectively immune to edicts, since you'll get an army token to sacrifice to the edict before it resolves. Sauron looks well positioned to keep gaining points in Legacy. At number 8, it's Nicol Bolas God Pharaoh, which was at number 2 last time. I promised you more Nicol Bolas, didn't I? For 4 generic and 1 of each Grixis color, this Bolas is a 7 loyalty planeswalker who packs 4 loyalty abilities. He's got a +2 that makes your opponent exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, and then you get to cast that card for free. He's got a +1 that makes your opponent exile 2 cards from their hand, a -4 that does 7 to an opponent creature or planeswalker, and a -12 that exiles all opposing non-land permanents. So, once again, we have a very powerful planeswalker who usually wins the game if you can get it into play, but it is a little tricky to cast, though God Pharaoh is significantly easier to get into play than Nicol Bolas the Planeswalker that we saw earlier. He saw some play in Grixis control decks while he was in Standard, and since 2020, he's also picked up a single point in a Pioneer Fires of Invention deck. With Fires in play, Nicol Bolas is significantly easier to cast. The God Pharaoh hasn't gained any points so far in 2023, and its future on the list may be in jeopardy. At number 7, it's Evelyn the Covetous, a newcomer to the list from Streets of New Capenna. New Capenna was, of course, the most recent set to prominently feature this 3-color combination, and that set the faction was called Maestros. Anyway, Evelyn costs 2 generic, a blue-black hybrid mana, a black mana, and a black-red hybrid mana. In other words, it's possible to play her in a mono-black deck, a black-red deck, or a black-blue deck without too much trouble. She's a 2/5 with flash, and when she or another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, you exile the top card of each player's library with a collection counter on it. Then once each turn, you can play a card from exile with a collection counter on it, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. In other words, she's a 5-mana 2/5 that effectively draws you 2 cards, and has the potential to deliver even more value than that if you've got some other vampires in your deck. She's gained all of her points in Standard, in Grixis mid-range decks that generally feature several other vampires, so you can get some impressive mileage out of her ability. So far though, she doesn't have any points in 2023, and while she's in Standard for quite a bit longer, she might be done gaining points. At number 6, it's Shadow Guildmage, which wasn't on the list last time, but this isn't because it's a new card or an old card that has since gained points. It's because the way I do lists based on color combinations has changed. Back in the 2020 video, I only did cards with Grixis mana costs, instead of looking at the broader category of Grixis identity. Shadow Guildmage is the only card that would have made the list last time if I had used the updated criteria I used today, and if it did have a spot on the list, it would have been at number 2 last time with its 8 points. Of course, this time, 8 points was only good enough for number 6. Anyway, Shadow Guildmage costs 1 black and is a 1/1 with 2 activated abilities. One of them costs 1 blue mana and puts a creature you control on top of its owner's library, and the other one costs 1 red and pings a creature or player and you. It saw some success in Mirage Block Constructed, showing up in Grixis mid-range decks, where both abilities had their place. For example, the deck ran Necrotal and Mana War, 2 creatures with enter the battlefield abilities that were quite powerful if you could draw that card every single turn. Shadow Guildmage saw play in a similar deck in Standard, and the ping ability was pretty nice too, capable of killing small creatures and helping you finish off your opponent. All that said, Shadow Guildmage found all of its success back in 1997, and it doesn't seem likely it will ever gain any more points. At number 5, it's Cruel Ultimatum, which came in at number 1 last time. While this card doesn't have Nicol Bolas in the name, it is another Bolas card, as you can see from the art, which shows Bolas' shadow looming over a very scared-looking demon. For 2 blue, 3 black, and 2 red, this sorcery makes your opponent sack a creature, discard 3 cards, and lose 5 life. Meanwhile, you get a mirror image of those effects. You return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, draw 3, and gain 5 life. So, it's hard to cast, but if the person who cast it is allowed to untap after casting this, they'll pretty much be unstoppable. As you might expect, it was played in control decks in Standard. This included 4 and 5 color control decks, some of which were dubbed Cruel Control because the deck's main game plan was about getting to cast Cruel Ultimatum. These decks were featured in both Standard and Extended, but the Ultimatum doesn't have any points since 2010. At number 4, it is Nicol Bolas the Ravager, which was at number 3 last time. This version of Bolas features the Elder Dragon before and after he became a Planeswalker. For 1 generic and 1 of each Grixis color, he's a 4/4 flyer that makes the opponent discard a card from their hand when he enters the battlefield. You can also pay 4 generic and 1 of each Grixis color to exile the Ravager and transform it into Nicol Bolas the Arisen. As is Bolas tradition, he's a Planeswalker that can really break the game, and he should be, because it takes some significant work to gain access to him. Anyway, he starts with 7 loyalty, has a +2 that draws 2, a -3 that does 10 to a creature or Planeswalker, a -4 that reanimates a creature or Planeswalker, and a -12 that exiles all but the bottom card of target player's library. So, up front, the Ravager gives you a pretty sweet 2-for-1, and if the game goes long enough, he turns into a very real win condition. While in Standard, he was played in Grixis midrange and control decks. He also sees play in multiple Pioneer decks, including that format's version of Grixis midrange, as well as Bring to Light and Fires of Invention decks. Bring to Light decks can tutor him up in ideal situations, like to get the last card out of your opponent's hand, and he works great in Fires of Invention decks because you don't have any spells to use mana on, but you can use all that mana to transform him. He's likely to keep gaining points in the future, but the 3 cards in front of him are also quite active, so this might be the best he can ever do. At number 3, it is Nicol Bolas Dragon God, which was at number 6 last time. That makes it the only card from the 2020 list that actually moved up. For 1 blue, 3 black, and a red, he's a 4 loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 that draws a card while each opponent exiles a card from their hand or a permanent they control, a -3 that destroys a creature or a Planeswalker, and a -8 that makes each opponent who doesn't control a legendary creature or Planeswalker lose the game. Compared to the other Bolases we've seen so far, this version doesn't really have the ability to immediately dominate a game with its loyalty abilities, but he's also got a really great static ability because he has all loyalty abilities of every other Planeswalker on the battlefield. People generally play Nicol Bolas Dragon God alongside other Planeswalkers, and the fact that he can have access to opposing Planeswalker activated abilities is great too. It isn't like the base abilities it has are terrible either. Obviously, if you ever get to the ultimate, it's got a pretty good chance of just winning you the game. While in Standard, the Dragon God was played in Grixis control decks that ran plenty of other Planeswalkers, but it managed to move up this list by seeing significant play in Pioneer over the last 3 years. Its most frequent home there is Mono Green Devotion. That might sound like it doesn't make any sense, since this costs 3 colors of mana that are in fact not green, but mono green devotion decks have 2 ways to put Bolas into play anyway. One of these is Oath of Nissa, which lets you pay whatever mana you want for planeswalkers. The other is Storm the Festival, a sorcery that lets you put into play 2 cards with mana value 5 or less from the top 5 cards of your library, and Bolas is simply one of the strongest 5 mana cards in the format, especially because the deck runs other planeswalkers. Nicol Bolas is likely to keep gaining points, and it isn't entirely out of the question that he can move up the list in the future. At number 2, it is Bladecoil Serpent, a newcomer to the list that didn't even exist back in 2020. For X and 6 generic, it's a 5/4 artifact creature, and it gives you an enter the battlefield ability based on the mana you spend to cast it. The X in the cost is only there so that you can sink as much mana into it as you want. For every blue you pay, you get to draw a card. For every black your opponent discards a card. And for every red, it gets +1/+0 in haste and gains trample until end of turn. If you have the right kind of mana, the Serpent can be completely insane. If you manage to pay 2 of each of these colors, we're talking about a 6 mana 6/5 with trample and haste that draws you a card and makes the opponent discard. And you can of course also go all in on one of the enter the battlefield abilities if you have the mana and you want to. The Serpent has seen a ton of play in Standard, largely in Grixis control decks, and it has a lot of time left in the format. But those things are also both true of the number 1 card on the list, which is Corpse Appraiser. For one of each of the Grixis colors, you get a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target creature from a graveyard. When you do that, you look at the top 3 cards of your library and put one of them into your hand, and the others in the graveyard. This 3 mana 3/3 delivers some insane value. It can hate on the graveyard, draw you a card, and load your graveyard, all things you're pretty happy to do in Standard right now. It's a big part of what has made Grixis midrange and control decks so good in Standard from 2022 onwards, and it's also seen a bit of play in Pioneer. It's likely to keep gaining points going forward, and I envision it staying as the number 1 card on this list for quite a while. So, those are the top 10 Grixis cards in Magic. If you're a fan of this color combination, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it to increase its reach. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at color combinations, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.